Hi, welcome to another episode of Pink Talks, a conversation about all things feminism. My name is Maria Luís.
And I'm Margarida Martins. We are your co hosts for today. In this Pink Talk, we will be discussing international development, sustainable development, and feminism as usual, and how they relate to each other, what issues they have in common, and how we can make sure that they interplay to find productive solutions to our current problems. But we'll develop a bit more on that further.
Yes, indeed. For now, we would like to introduce you to our two guest speakers, Rihanna Simões de Almeida and Professor Elizabeth Prugo. First of all, thank you so much for both for being here and taking on our invitation. So Ariana is a gender equality, empowerment, and inclusion expert with more than 15 years of experience across Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America. She is currently a gender expert for United Nations agencies and programs, and an award-winning social entrepreneur for having co-founded the first not-for-profit in Timor-Leste in support of local businesses in rural communities and expanding the economic empowerment of women living below the poverty line. Most recently, she also founded the Portuguese chapter of the project Girls for Girls, a women leadership mentorship program. So, Ariana, welcome. And again, thank you so much for taking on our invitation. Would you
Thank
maybe
you.
quickly a little bit about yourself, maybe add something to this little introduction?
I think that was a really good introduction. Thank you, and quite comprehensive. Maybe what I can just add is to say that for the audience that might not be as familiar with the thematic of feminism and gender equality and women empowerment, just to add a little bit more about what I do in practice. So I work with these programs and these agencies, but also including international NGOs and international cooperation agencies to design programs that have a focus on women empowerment and gender equality, and also with a focus on ending violence against women and girls. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about that today. And so what I do is I bring the gender lens to those programs. In some cases, they are programs that are fighting poverty or that are not specifically focusing on women empowerment and gender equality, but that want to have a gender lens. So they want to ensure that the interventions support women and gender equality, despite the fact that they are not focusing on that goal. Some other programs that I work with have that specific focus. So they are intervention that really are the ultimate goal is to promote gender equality and women empowerment. So I work in those two lines, and my big passion is the intersection between women economic empowerment interventions and gender-based violence. But we'll get more to that. Thank you.
Thank you. We will get more into that. That's very interesting. But now let me introduce our other guests. Elizabeth Prugo is Professor of International Relations and co-director of the Gender Center at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Her research and teaching focus is on feminist international relations. Fascinating topic, might I add. In particular, gender politics and international governance. And she has many publications, but some recent ones include results from two research for development projects on gender and land commercialization in Cambodia and Ghana, and on gender in peace building in Indonesia and Nigeria. So truly a very international approach. It's so nice to have you here again, Professor Prugo. Is there anything you want to add to this introduction or tell us more at this point?
No, just that I'm quite happy to be here. I'm tickled pink to be here, and I will try to do my very best not to be too theoretical. I'm just teaching a class this semester on feminist theory, so I'm constantly thinking about how everything started from the way in which men don't theorize the right way. So you will see me you will hear me talk about that. But I'll give you the floor for now.
Okay, sounds perfect, Professor Prugel. So as usual, and well, maybe also trying not to be too theoretical, we will start this episode with a little bit of an introduction to the topic. So today we're talking about feminism and international sustainable development, which is a construct that has been built up for many years with firm roots in a certain, let's call it a certain worldview, its thinking and its systems. And unfortunately, they don't serve everybody equally always. And in order to seek out true global development, we must seek out alternatives and enable those who are familiar and expert in them to occupy spaces and take the lead in struggles of justice and equality. Obviously, reaching these goals will then require action in all fronts. So, we're talking about governments, businesses, civil society, individual people to have a role to play in this.
Exactly. And so now the question, specifically for us and for our episode, is where does feminism come into this? What does feminism has to do with any of this? So a feminist perspective to international development, on par with increasing participation of marginalized groups on these activities, can elevate our global action and ensure it actually serves humanity. And empowering women and promoting gender equality is crucial to accelerating international development, and it's actually the only way to make it sustainable. And feminist strategies in international governance are key here. There are many, but they usually focus on areas such as women's human rights and violence against women, the participation of women in peacemaking and their protections during conflicts, and they also delve into the gendered effects of development, economic and financial governance.
Yes, so maybe as a as a simple start, we would like to ask both of you if you agree with this introduction, and meaning, how do you see the importance and relevance of a feminist lens on international development and its importance and its relevance? So maybe we can start with Professor Prugel, if you can give us a little bit on this.
Yes, I would be happy to, and thank you for that question. It's actually a really important question to reflect anew, I think, in the contemporary context, because I think the world has changed massively from the 1960s, when the development agenda was first put on the international on the international platform. And what I'm seeing today is, in addition to the massive health crisis that we're all encountering, which includes, of course, the pandemic, but it also includes what the pandemic has made visible, namely the massive underinvestment in the care sector, in the healthcare sector, but in the care sector more broadly. And I think the context matters. We also have today a massive, terrible ecological crisis. And the climate crisis shows how the way in which we have done growth, the way in which we have done economic development, has really basically amounted to devouring ourselves and putting ourselves out of existence. And in the context of all of this, there is a massive economic crisis, again accelerated by the health crisis and the ecological crisis, which have had very unequal impacts globally, between rich and poor countries in particular. But also we have seen large-scale job losses, especially in the services sector, and especially in the South, especially for people who were employed in the informal sector also. And along with that has come a new hunger, food insecurity that we saw as much here in Geneva, where we all of a sudden had huge food lines, people not being able to buy their everyday subsistence any longer. And you, of course, see it also massively around the world. So there's a huge crisis that we are in today. And it strikes me that that crisis cannot be understood outside the kind of economics that we have pursued, and economics that Sandra Harding says is based on abstract masculinity, which anchors the capitalist economy. It's based on economics as a discipline that takes as its starting point the abstract rule of free markets, which includes a focus on development that, again, sees as its goal growth, in the process perpetuating all kinds of violence, including, I would say, the neo-imperialism of various forms of extractivism. And we have that idea of a globalized market where geography is mostly a matter of distances that need to be somehow conquered. And the friction of what the material world actually constitutes is something that has to be overcome. So I think what feminism tells us, and what feminist economics and feminist ecology tells us, is that we cannot forget about the concrete, about the way in which, as human beings, we are dependent on each other, about how we all need care in most parts of our lives, as children, as old people, when we are sick. We're dependent on each other. We're dependent on the earth. We're dependent on the earth for nourishment. We are dependent. We need to remember our animal nature and how important it is to live in harmony with Earth. So I think that feminism contributes to that. That feminist economics in particular has long argued that we need to, rather than focus on profit and accumulation and growth, the economy should be focusing on provisioning. It should be focusing on the production of life or social reproduction, which is what women's unpaid labor does today. It needs to focus on the flourishing of humans and the not human life, or more than human life, around us. So I think what feminism tells us, feminist political economy, it puts forward this notion of care as a central element of the economy, a form of labor that repairs the world so that we can live in it as well as possible. It tells us about the fact that care work and the earth cannot be understood as free resources that we can appropriate more or less violently for purposes of accumulation. It tells us that caring needs to be a way of being that recognizes our connection to a particular ethos of the everyday. And I just to put forward a few suggestions from Maria Puig de la Bellacasa. She suggests that this attitude or this ethos can be summarized as care of earth, care of people, and return the surplus. Don't extract the surplus, but return the surplus. And I'm going to stop here. This is my theoretical introduction, because I've warned you. But I do think that theorizing of care and of theorizing the economy differently is really, really crucial to the way we need to be today. And so feminism has a very, very important message to tell the world today.
Thank you so much, Professor Prugel. That was really, really insightful. And I think thinking about a feminist perspective onto a discipline such as economy is extremely important, especially because of what you mentioned about well, sort of this abstract masculinity being on the basis of the economical system thinking, and maybe how we can shift that into, well, I would even put it into a caring based, maybe economical or thinking. And the honestly, the I was going to say the advantages, but really the it's not even so much that we get advantages from it; it's that we need to do it, because otherwise we're going to well, head into not such a great fate. So those are extremely interesting ideas that hopefully you can develop further a little bit down the line in this episode. But maybe Ariana, anything that you would like to add? What's your view what's your perspective on sort of feminism in international development?
Thank you. And yes, I agree. This is a really great start to this conversation, and the issue of care, and especially since the hit of COVID early in 2020 has been exacerbated tremendously in the way that it affected women and girls disproportionately. I think highlighted the importance, as Professor Prugel was saying, the importance of having these conversations and of really looking at what feminism means. And I think, and I would just go to the word for a second because words matter. And I think often what I find is that when we talk about feminism, there's some reactions of attack. We're being attacked by women who don't like men, or by women who want to, just change all the system, and men feel really frightened, and to be honest, many women react very negatively to the concept of feminism. So maybe it would be good to just pause there for a second and really just say what feminism means, because I think when we talk about feminism, when we talk about gender equality, we talk about attacking privilege. And the fact that privilege vastly resides on men, and Western men in particular, in many circumstances, but in all societies, we have privilege of men. When we are challenging privilege, and when we are saying that what we want is a society, what we want is a world that is established on the basis of equality of all genders, then of course there is a need of disruption. But what I think is important is to say that when we talk about feminism, we're not saying it's women against men. It's recognizing the historic and the social imbalances that we have between women and men, girls and boys, and leveling the playing field, and saying, well, because we acknowledge these differences, we acknowledge that we need to have an approach where we address those differences intentionally. And that's what gender mainstreaming means, and it's also what programs that have a feminist approach do, is to recognize that change, that need of change. And one thing that is interesting is that a few countries, not many, I think about 5 or 6 now, since 2014, there's been a focus of some countries to talk about the feminist foreign policy. So truly talking about that framing. And again, some critics say, well, should we be using feminism as the concept when this has such a potential negative impact for those that are on the mainstream? And I'm not going to go into the debate of using the word feminism. I understand the critics. I think words matter, and I think holding countries, organizations, programs accountable matters. I think we can talk about feminism, by talking about equality, by talking about care, by talking about sustainability. I think what we're actually just saying when we're talking about a feminist approach to international development is saying that agencies and NGOs, countries need to recognize these imbalances and need to target them intentionally, because we have sufficient evidence by now that the benefits of doing so are tremendous, and they are across the board. They are impacts in terms of reducing poverty, impacts in terms of increasing the level of education. And when we have half the population who are women and girls, and we are not nurturing their full potential, we are losing. We are losing the ability of women to be engaged in policy, and therefore bringing different diverse perspectives into policymaking. We lose women on the leadership of companies, and therefore losing the development of different types of products or different approaches to leadership. We lose when we have women that are not able to progress because they're the amount of care and domestic work that they hold is disproportional, even though they work outside the home as many hours as their partners. And so all of these things, again, and going back to the beginning, are not attacking men, but they are attacking privilege. And we need to, and international development needs to take this into account. And so not only the structures of organizations, but the programs that they invest on and the way the programs are designed, implemented, and monitored need to have these issues into consideration. So I think it's undisputable. I think the benefits are also undisputable. And I think the only thing we need to do is to make sure that we continue to advocate, continue to share data, continue to share evidence and good practice to make sure that no matter what regardless of the words that we use, the important thing is to say we need to address these historic imbalances and take them very intentionally forward.
Thank you, Ariana. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. It's interesting you started by tackling the potential issues with the terminology of feminism. Interestingly enough, we talked about that in our last episode about men, masculinity, and feminism, about why so many people, especially men, but not only men, have so much resistance would identify as a feminist or feel so attacked by the terminology. And yeah, maybe it's because of the bad press it has been giving for so many decades. It's been associated with a negative connotations, but that's very interesting. You started with that, and also the rest of your address reminded me of a speech by Michelle Obama in which she said, "The measure of any society is how it treats its women and girls," and I think that is very, very much true. So to kickstart our discussion, maybe I have a question for Professor Pruger. Let's then discuss some strategies, if you don't mind, on how to integrate a feminist overview on international policy. So as an example, one of the main strategies at a global level at the moment that we have to measure and incentivize global development are the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. And many see in the SDGs several opportunities for progress and gender equality and women's rights. And there is a need to include a feminist and empowerment perspective on all of the goals. There are 17 goals, and not only on goal 5, which is the one dedicated specifically to gender equality and women's empowerment. Yeah. Like Ariana mentioned before, gender mainstreaming is key in this struggle. And now I would ask you to, if you could, Professor, expand on your view on this complex concept of gender mainstreaming. As Ariana said, words are very important, and for this discussion, it's important that we have a definition for this terminology, and how you see gender mainstreaming in the SDG discussion and the broad sustainable development discussion at the global level.
Yes, that's an excellent question, Margarita. I think it might be useful to recall the definition of gender mainstreaming that Ariana, I'm sure knows by heart, and that goes back to the actually the term itself was first introduced into international language in the 1995 Beijing platform for women. But there's a definition that the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, provided a few years later, and it's more or less something like the following. Gender mainstreaming is the effort to introduce into all policy programs and all planning at all stages the consideration of whether what the impact will be of these policies and programs, with the intent of making sure that these policies and programs don't inadvertently disadvantage women, the goal being gender equality. So there's a number of elements in that. Gender mainstreaming, in a way, was a reaction to previous programs, because a lot of programming previously had focused very specifically on women, and governments had established and organizations had established women's departments or women's ministries or women's machineries. And there was a feeling in the policy world that these programs were ghettoized. They got a small amount of money, and then you did a little bit of crafts production for women, and everybody was very happy because something was done for women and nothing changed. So gender mainstreaming, in a sense, was something very radical. It was to say, well, it's not the women's department that takes care of women, but women are, surprise, surprise, they're actually everywhere. And gender is everywhere. And because gender informs societies throughout, if we want to change gender relations, we actually need to change them everywhere. Now, a radical concept that had a hell of a time being accepted. And there was an enormous amount of resistance in all kinds of agencies, and people were saying, yeah, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we are doing, I don't know, economics. What does gender matter to economics? Or, we're doing transport. That's such a technical thing. It has nothing to do with gender. And very often you had, big policy statements, but then when it came to translating gender mainstreaming, virtually nothing happened, or as some scholars put it, there was kind of an evaporation of the policy as you went down the hierarchies. The SDGs are interesting with regard to this. The SDGs don't give up on gender mainstreaming, where a lot of feminists actually got really angry with this. At a certain point said, this is just, we're being co-opted. They're pretending like they're doing anything, but they're actually not doing a thing. And I think actually something massive has happened the last few years around that. I wonder whether Ariana agrees with that. But I do think that, all the talk for, 20 years and nothing happening actually did lay the groundworks. And one of the things that it did is it actually generated something that I call in some of my work gender expertise. People like Ariana, right? People that actually have expertise on the one hand on how to change institutions through human resources strategies and other strategies, but also people who have expertise in technical areas such as development, health, education, and so on, and are really anchored in those fields and can speak to the way in which gender matters in those fields. And I think that's parallel a little bit to what happened with the SDGs. By virtue of the SDGs saying, it matters, gender matters, not just in Goal 5, like you say, but it matters everywhere. There was now a demand to not just create expertise, but to create accountability mechanisms within those goals. And one of the things about the SDGs is they are so, I mean, it's not just the goals, but then there's targets and the indicators. Right? And so there's a huge machinery around that about measuring what actually happens. I know you're going to ask me questions about data later on. Data has become like really central to the way in which we're doing development. There's all kinds of problems with that. And talk about the problems. But one of the things that it has achieved is actually that people in all sectors are talking all the time about, but how we're going to measure this, or is this a good measurement? And as they're asking those questions, they're actually starting to reflect of what these things mean, such as gender equality in a certain sector, right? Or what does it mean to have equality in education, or and so on. And I just finished rereading a dissertation from a student I supervised, and she actually looked at the implementation of the SDGs in East Africa, and she talks about how they're even though it's very technocratic, there is so much discussion about the data and whether the indicators are too universalizing and what a local indicator would mean and how it can be adjusted, that discussion about data in itself has become a form of policy making. And I think this is really, really interesting. So that the discussion about data leads to people actually kind of appropriating and translating the SDGs into local contexts, while at the same time being able to criticize it also and repoliticize it and say, that may be true for other countries, but in our country, this is what we are going to be understanding by gender equality. So I think they're really, really interesting, but I really would like to hear what Ariana has to say about that, because she actually works with it.
Yeah, it's indeed quite interesting. I mean, if we're talking about expertise and then accountability, I think we're just starting to go right up Ariana's alley. But before, I'd just like to mark a point here of it's quite interesting what you say about it being a technical topic and a technical issue that most people wouldn't associate with the need for maybe accountability for gender equality. But it's quite interesting how those things then affect people. I'm just thinking that right now a huge topic as well in, let's say, foreign policy is product standards, which has absolutely nothing to do with our discussion here today. But it's something that it's super technical, and no one would really think that it would matter, but it's something that affects, for example, quality testing. And then we can talk about how, for example, most equipment testing for health equipment or protection equipment is not done taking into account the multitude of different ways of life and different people that exist in the world. So it's very interesting, that sort of point on technical topics. But getting back to the whole idea of expertise and accountability, so there's this a wide consensus among the gender experts. Feel free to question that, Ariane, of course. That the most successful models for feminist developments combine a strong women's policy agenda agencies with a strategy of gender mainstreaming, which we have discussed now. You have said before, Ariana, that fighting inequality is how ultimately we build safer, more inclusive, and more respectful communities, workplaces, schools, families, just public spaces. So how do you think these models have delivered so far when we're talking about, accountability? Meaning, what do you think of the current status quo?
Thank you. I think, I don't know how much time we have. This could take us a long time to unpack. But I would start by saying, and just voicing what Professor Prugo was saying before. I think the journey is long, and it's full of bumps. But I think we've progressed a lot. So I wanted to start there. I wanted to say that I think there's a lot of reasons to be positive. I think we have gender in the spotlight now as I have not seen before. I'm 40 years old, so I haven't seen a lot, but I've seen a bit, and I agree with the fact that when we're saying, well, we need gender experts in programs of water and sanitation, transports. We need gender experts to be working at different program cycles. We need gender experts when we look at organizational restructuring. We need gender experts in the private sector as well as in the public sector. I think this is a huge acknowledgement that this expertise was needed and that we need to put a gender lens into the work we do in the different sectors. And I was giving a training a few months ago in a project. It's a project that ended in the meantime, but it was a program to support women with disabilities to enter the marketplace in Bangladesh and Kenya. Was a program supported by the UK government. And a lot of the organizations and a lot of the partners who are private sector companies kept asking the question, why are we, okay, it's people with disabilities. It doesn't matter if it's a woman or a man, it's just people with disabilities, and we need to bring them into the market. And these were obviously organizations that were very used to working with disability inclusion. And so my work, for example, was to work with them and raise awareness that actually women with disabilities have a range of issues that affect them because they are women and because they have disabilities. And this is what we call intersectionality. But the words, I mean, that's beside the point now. The important thing is to say, I think that the fact that programs, for example, this was a huge consortium of partners that decided, the UK government said, you need to have an organization that is your gender partner in this journey, because we acknowledge that it will be hard for partners, both disability inclusion organizations and private sector, to understand why we need to look at women with a different lens. And so I think that's a huge progress. I think we have the SDGs, we have very ambitious goal in terms of gender equality. I think, yes, we could have done better in mainstreaming gender, but I think there is at least a clear approach in terms of how we want to look at gender as a catalyst for sustainable development, and looking at gender equality as a catalyst for sustainable development. And I think we have within the sustainable, we have within the 2030 agenda, the leave no one behind approach, which does look also at, in a general sense, looks at women and women in vulnerable situations as specific targets within every goal. So I think we've progressed over the last decades. We've seen also progress in the various indicators, and we were talking about data. In education, we've seen a lot of progress. We've seen more women in parliaments. We've seen more women in boards of public companies. We are, I think, at a moment where we can say we're starting to see the fruits of the investment in talking about gender equality, in promoting it, and in putting it in a central spot. I think, as I said, the journey is long, and I was just looking a few weeks ago at the World Economic Forum reports that looks at how many years we need at the current rate to achieve gender parity, and the numbers are very concerning, and they have been affected negatively with COVID. So we were at I don't know, I think 130 years to achieve overall gender parity. And I think now, and I wrote it down so I don't forget, it's 136 years now, I think. So we've the number of years we need is beyond my lifetime, all our lifetimes, to achieve gender equality, and that's concerning. And this is the overall number. When we look at education, for example, the scenario is a little bit more positive. We have, I think, 14 years to achieve gender parity, which is really good, and it's one area where we've seen a lot of progress. But then, and we've seen this in many countries, we have women going through, all the way through university, and then we look at the gap in political representation, the gap in economic representation, and these continue to be in 3 digits. 140 years to 150 years. I mean, this is still where we stand at the moment. And so while we need to celebrate, I think, the achievements, and say that, yes, the fact that we were able to not only look at a specific agenda, but also mainstream gender across various sectors and various moments within projects and organizations. I think we're becoming more aware that we need to continue to hold organizations and programs accountable. I think we have now more gender markers that help us in that process. A lot of organizations are saying, as Professor Prugel was saying, what gender mainstreaming, what is this, and what does it matter? I think then there was a moment where people were saying, well, I understand it matters, but I can't really deal with it. I have no one to, how are we going to do this? And I think we're now at a moment where organizations do have that sensitivity. They're putting the investments in their budgets, in their plans, more and more. We can see that. And I think we're having, we're seeing organizations saying, okay, we need to have these markers to have our benchmarks. So we're going from the moment where we say, let's invest in gender mainstreaming, to a moment where we say, well, what type of organization are we, or what type of program are we? And so we have the terminology of gender neutral, gender blind, or gender unaware, gender neutral, gender sensitive, and gender transformative. So we're looking at a range of awareness about gender and a level of accountability that has increased significantly. And I think my experience with programs at local level, but also at a global level, is that we can't stop this effort. And I think we can only continue to reinforce it and advocate for it, because the 3 digits is an unacceptable reality. But I do think that we need to celebrate and acknowledge the efforts, because both at the public and private sector, I think we've come already a long way, and there's still a long way to go.
Thank you so much, Ariana. That is very interesting what you say, that you saw so much change during your lifetime. I would risk saying that even Maria and I saw a lot of change in the discourse around feminism, and how seriously it is taken in our lifetime. So that is encouraging. But at the same time, like you said, the numbers could be a lot better. And I would like to ask you both, Ariana and Professor Prugel, in the following what we've been talking about so far. So, as you said, gender mainstreaming should entail integrating gender concerns throughout the policy process, going beyond simply adding women and expecting outcomes to change and improve. And I think, just very shortly, what I wanted to ask is, how can we ensure active participation of minority social groups in international development, while avoiding that gender inclusion turns into just a technocratic exercise, ticking of boxes, if you will, rather than a meaningful look at how exactly gender impacts different individuals. And this goes a bit into the intersectionality aspect you were talking about, Oriana. But I wanted to ask you how you think this can be done. Is it like more a bottom-up approach? It has to come from the local level rather than the international level? Professor Prugel, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a hard question. To begin with, I think of gender mainstreaming as it's a top-down exercise by definition. This is the SDGs is something that was developed from the United Nations level, yes, with lots of participation and consultation and so on, but ultimately it is a top-down exercise, and there is and it's technocratic by definition, right? You have the goals, it's a planning tool, you have the targets, and even the language we speak, it's a very technical language. In my experience, for the most part, feminist activists are not particularly interested in the SDGs. I mean, it's not what they get excited about, and whether mainstreaming has happened or it hasn't happened. But having said that, and I think I said that earlier, I think we sometimes underestimate how political implementation is. So that to begin with, I talked about the gender experts earlier, and Ariana, it was interesting to hear you talk about feminism in that context, because we did a research project a few years ago where we actually we did a survey and we asked people, gender experts, people working in various international governmental and non-governmental organizations on gender. We asked them, would you consider yourself to be a feminist? And I was actually shocked by the results. Like a whole 40% of these people did not consider themselves to be feminists. And, it made me wonder, why are you working on that? I still don't understand this. But actually, to turn this around, I think what to be more hopeful about it, okay, 60% did consider themselves to be feminist. So in other words, there are in these organizations a large number of women who are have expertise in particular areas, but they also understand that this is not just a matter of box ticking, as you say, but this is a political process. And the reason that there is resistance, and the reason that we have all these arguments as to why it's good to have gender equality and so on, it's to some extent also a sales job, right? And it's awareness raising. It's kind of also, making sure people aren't scared. Oh my God, it's not, doesn't mean that that all men are going to be killed if there is gender equality. So it's and there's a lot of I don't know, kind of irrational fears that are associated with that. But okay, so that's on the one hand, right? So I think it maybe is really more than a technocratic exercise. But then you have this other really interesting question, how about the active participation of what you call minority social groups? And I'm gonna become theoretical here again, but I think one of the things that is maybe worrisome, but certainly something one has to observe, is that the discourse of gender mainstreaming and international discourse more broadly, it's a very binary discourse, right? So there's women and there are men. And it's that opposition that is in the center. And, we know the queer critique of that, of the binary not just simply being that. But I think there's also a really interesting critique of that from the perspective of African women. I've heard that increasingly. And I'm thinking particularly of Oyewumi's book, The Invention of Women, in which she basically argues that gender is actually a Western imposition on Africa, that there is no such thing as women in the abstract in Africa. And she works through Yoruba culture there, and it's the complicated kinship systems that exist there, and kind of emphasizing how being a daughter and being a wife are very different things, and there's very different power that comes with that. Being a mother is yet a totally different thing, again, with an enormous amount of power and often political power in some of the West African structures. So to lump all of these kinds of people into the category women and say that they are oppressed doesn't make any sense from a West African perspective. I mean, I'm really simplifying her argument, but that's the gist of it. So that the language that we have developed, and that's not just gender mainstreaming, that's the whole human rights system. It's the way Western feminism, frankly, talks, is very simplistic in a sense in comparison to many other parts of the world. And that worries me a little bit, because I think it just blinds out so much of what is happening in terms of power dynamics, empowerments that already exist, and also resources that exist in the field of gender equality or not.
Can I just add?
Yes,
I know that we're doing
yeah.
the regulation, but I just want to add something, and I think that's an excellent point, and I think it happens, I agree, across the board. I think I've had that discussion, for example, about poverty. What does poverty mean? It's like this concept, and while we sometimes need to simplify concepts in order to, get traction and get buy-in and advocate, it is true that when we're talking about what do minorities mean, how can we bring them into the discussion, this is a much larger conversation, and it's what are we talking about when we talk about minorities, in what contexts, and how can we talk about inclusion of minorities in the same way across so many different realities. So I think that's an excellent point. So I don't have anything else to add to what Professor Prugel said. I just wanted to touch very quickly on the issue of the political, the top-down approach that we were talking about. And I just to say that there's a lot of value in bottom-up approaches, and I'm a strong advocate that we need to have that in order to get buy-in from communities and to actually effect change that is transformative change. But we also need to acknowledge the importance of having political investment in change. And I was just thinking, I just came from a 2-week session in Senegal where I was doing the first in-person assessment to recruit more women to peace operations from the UN. And it's the first time that this is being done. And it's being done under a new gender parity strategy that was approved in 2018 for uniformed personnel, so for the police, the military, corrections, and justice personnel that is deployed to peace missions. And it's incredible because in 3 years, the number of women deployed went from 25 to corrections, so not across the board, but to corrections positions, so women that work in prisons in post-conflict countries, increased from 25% to close to 40%. And are we ticking a box? We are also ticking a box, it's true, but we are doing incredible progress because there's a guidance, there's a commitment that enables this unit, for example, to say to member states that nominate personnel from their security sector to these missions, they can say, we will not accept all men nomination. So that is change. We will consider more strongly countries that have a 50% pool of women in their nominations. So when we do these things, and I can even go to more, simple day-to-day examples. When we organize an event and we organize a panel, and we look at that panel, and the panel is all white male in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And we see that still today often. I often wonder what happened, right? What happened? What were people thinking about? when they look, didn't they find this odd when they were planning? And the truth is that I've inquired, when I was so surprised that I bothered to inquire, and people were like, we were so busy thinking of other things and doing other things that we just didn't have the mindset to think about this. And so, checklists are important. They're not all that matters, but having them and being accountable to them and being able to have some frameworks that force us to change our mindset and to look at it, a panel and say, oh, wow, wait, this doesn't work. There's lack of representation here. These things, I think, are really important. And while we can't just rely on that, I think they need to be there for then change to take place.
Thank you. That's a great, I think, even roundup to this whole discussion that we've been having about gender mainstreaming and how to sort of bring a feminist lens into, international development, but also in general discussions. And well, it's also sort of a public service announcement. If you're having events, please don't have what is called a manual. Please don't do that. You've been warned now.
Exactly.
But really, really a nice round off to this this discussion, and interesting that you bring up peace building and security issues, because Professor Prugel has an article that is titled "Mobilizing Gender for Conflict Prevention: Women's Situation Rooms." Where it's discussed the role of women that has become central or should become central in debates on conflict prevention, resolution, and peace building, not least because it is on the Security Council's Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So, Professor Prugel, to your view, and maybe, as clearly and shortly as you might be able to, how do you think gender can be used as a sort of productive force to counteract violence, and on the other hand, for peace building?
Thank you, Maria, for asking about that article. Actually, the article was kind of an effort to say how to take gender seriously as something that we're theorizing in gender studies as not just being women, right? And so often we fall back to, okay, it's all about women and it's about including women, and the parity agenda that Ariana talked about is actually so much about, getting equal numbers of women. But there's more to gender than adding women in equal amounts to existing structures, actually, right? And so in this particular article, we looked at the women's situation rooms, which is an effort in various African countries to intervene to prevent electoral violence. And so what we say there is, well, why do these initiatives work? We ask ourselves, why do these initiatives work? And the immediate answer would be, of course, well, women are more peaceful, right? But we know women are not more peaceful, right? Margarita, just that frown. We know we are not. So, but why does that work? And why then mobilize women and have such a thing as a women's situation room and not just a situation room and so on? And so what we are suggesting is that they actually work because of gender, because they the way in which they engage with gender. So it's, to begin with, 3 elements here. To begin with, it's not just women who are organizing these situation rooms, but it's actually feminists who are anchored in movements, who have big networks that they can activate, who are organized, right? Who actually have power because they are politically organized. Secondly, it works because they play on the idea that as women, they are located outside politics. they're not really politicians, even though, you know, it's a contradiction. On the one hand, they're activists, and so they're really, really political. On the other hand, they're saying, no, but we are neutral. We are outside the political system. We are not associated with these different parties that might be at loggerheads with each other. So therefore, we can actually come in and we can mediate. And there's a lot of mediation actually that is happening. And then finally, it works because they play in many instances on the idea that they are mothers. So it's that idea of motherhood that they style themselves as a particular construction of femininity, and you know, motherhood is mother, as I talked about earlier. It's a very powerful figure in many African contexts, and they talk about that, and in particular, I recall in Ghana, one of the countries that we studied, you know, these women were going into the slums and wanted to talk with youth gangs, because youth gangs are often the ones that are actually being activated by various politicians who want to go after their opponents. So they're very much at the bottom of many of this violence. And, you know, and they say, and we went in and we made sure none of the men came with us. And these gang leaders would talk to us, and we would tell them, we're talking to you as your mothers. You are our sons. You know, we are in this family together. We don't behave like this in our family. We want you to pledge. We want you to come along with us. And it was apparently incredibly successful. So the message in the article really, it's gender is powerful. Constructions of gender are powerful. Constructions of femininity as mothers is powerful. Constructions of women as outside the economy, outside politics, as much as we may hate that, is actually powerful and can be used. And of course, creating feminist networks and organizing around the identity of women is powerful, because it gives you a reason for agency.
That's
very
great.
interesting.
Very insightful, and really sort of exposes and tells us about how gender can inform peace building in its many definitions and many sort of conceptualizations, and how this sort of intersection between several identities and several identity categories can make peace building efforts stronger, and how sometimes they might be overlooked. How sometimes they might be overlooked. Could you just then, as maybe circling back to the beginning of our episode, tell us a little bit about the importance of and the power of good data in this effort?
In peace building?
Yes.
Oh. Not sure I can answer that question very well.
That's all right.
I mean, I do think one thing that is really, really important for peace building is to think beyond women, and also to think beyond gender. And coming back to another issue that you brought up earlier, that's the issue of intersectionality. And, you know, a lot of peace building literature talks about how, you know, ethnicity or other status distinctions can be a source of conflict, and then they always go very fast to say, well, but gender is actually not a source of conflict, because, you know, you never have the men arguing or fighting the women and vice versa, so we don't have to really worry about that. And the argument I would like to make there is that it's really important to look at these differences in an intersectional manner, because it again brings into fore the way in which these differences or different groups actually play with gender in conflict escalation processes in particular. I mean, so much. One of the logics that we identify in a different project is the logic of masculinist protection, that other people have talked about. It's not something that I invented, but it's very often triggered when there is rumors, and often it's rumors about sexual violence. So it's like, oh, they have violated our women. We are good men. Because we are good men, we have to protect our women. So let's go out and kill them all, right? So gender actually matters in these communal conflicts as a conflict driver. As much a minute ago, I was talking about gender as a force for conflict resolution, but it also can become a force it can become a conflict driver in this context. And so when I think about data in this context, I would think about understanding how communities are structured along multiple axes of difference, because it will allow us to understand more extensively how conflict can then be managed productively.
Okay, I'm sorry if the question was a bit too. You answered it very well, thank you. So now, unfortunately, we are basically out of time, but we do not want to leave without asking at least one more question. And we have a lot of many other questions, but we'll have to keep them maybe for another time. But we wanted to ask Ariana, your work focuses so much on ending violence against women. We didn't want to finish without mentioning that at least. Could you very briefly tell us about that, and maybe about the UN Spotlight initiative and that global project to end violence against women and promote gender equality?
I'm muted, of course. This has happened. I'm going to be very brief. I wanted to just make a note to say it's interesting, and I'm going to read that article from Professor Prugel because it's interesting how, in many ways, we want to eliminate gender from the equation, right? We want to say we want people to be treated the same way, have the same opportunities, regardless of gender. And then in some cases, and we could go back to that definition or that difference between sex and gender. Are we talking about gender? Are we talking, is it the role, or is it, the unique characteristic of women as child bearers that gave them that leverage? But also you were talking about being a wife and how that also gives them power in certain circumstances. So it's really interesting how sometimes we want to say, well, let's take gender out of the equation, let's treat everyone the same. And then at some, in other moments, we should be embracing and saying, there's power in this difference. How can we leverage to our benefit, to the benefit of all? So it's, maybe a topic for another discussion. On ending violence against women and girls, 2 notes that I wanted to quickly make. One, as I said, one of my passions, I don't get to work on it as much as I wanted, but one of the things that really moves me and that I invest as much as I can is to work on the intersection of women economic empowerment initiatives and gender-based violence. So looking at how we are, on the one hand, promoting women's empowerment, but how that disrupts the power dynamics and challenges gender roles, and how that can have a pervasive impact and have a backlash against the women that we are trying to benefit. And so looking at programs that do that have that investment from the lens of how are we building these programs, implementing them, monitoring, so that women do not have, so that we are able to mitigate the risk of violence against women that we are working to go into that journey of more leadership and more autonomy. The Spotlight Initiative is a huge program. I think to capture it in a minute, it would be to say it's a demonstration fund, and it's a huge global partnership between the European Union and the United Nations, where it's implemented across countries that have been selected in Africa, Latin America, the Asia Pacific, and the Caribbean. And it focuses on promoting gender equality and ending violence against women and girls through a really complex approach that tries to address some of these issues that we were discussing today, which are how we cannot look at violence per se. We cannot just look at the experience of violence and say, okay, we need to respond to this episode. But we can also, we can't simply say we need to prevent these actions. We need to have a more holistic approach, and that's what the program aims to do. So it works under 6 different pillars, data being one of them. Data being one of them because the importance of having consistent and clear data is critical to inform policy changes. It's important to inform legislation development. It's critical also to improve response against violence. So data being one of the pillars, and then looking at improving laws and policies, as I said, strengthening institutions, so working very closely with the governments to localize the program and to make sure that governments are and parliaments are prepared to put forward better legislation and implement better programs to promote gender equality and fight violence against women. Also looking at the issues of prevention. So there's a lot of effort in communication, and a lot of effort in gender transformative approaches. So for example, working with traditional leaders, working with community leaders, working with religious leaders to raise awareness, for example, on the impact of violence, on the impact of child marriage. So bringing these actors into the fight against harmful practices, against violence, having a very intentional also approach to engaging women, boys and men in the program. And then, as I said, improving services for women who experience violence, because making them more centered in the survivor and making them more accessible through mobile clinics, through community outreach posts, etc. And then I've talked about all the pillars now, except for a very important one. And I think we've talked a little bit about this, the importance of community organizations. So really, really strong focus on working with community-based organizations, working with civil society organizations, working with activists, feminists, because again, all this effort just doesn't make sense if we need both sides. We need to have the top-down approach where we say this matters and this is important, but then we need to have a bottom-up approach where we're training, empowering, supporting community-based structures to actually effect change. So that's it. That's a summary of the work, and I've been very privileged to work with the design and then the implementation of projects in 3 different continents already, in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. So yeah, it's a huge effort that is worth following. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share this. I'm very happy to be able to share this with you.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful and very, I think, a nice ending to this episode. We are sort of reaching the end of our episode, and I think we've had some very interesting and insightful takeaways to this topic, to international development and feminism, and how can it work in theory, how does it work in practice, and I think hopefully it will be a nice discussion for our listeners to be a little bit more informed about this topic. So we are reaching the end of this episode. We'd like to thank our guests, Ariana Simões Almeida and Professor Elizabeth Brugel, for their presence and brilliant insights.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Your time is valuable, and we appreciate that you gave us some of it. Would also like to thank our listeners for your interest in these very important topics, and I guess we'll see you in our next Think Talks episode.